Keanu Reeves had always been known for his humble and down-to-earth nature, a rarity in Hollywood, where fame often inflated egos beyond recognition. On this particular morning, he found himself in a quaint, locally owned cafe tucked away in a bustling city district, a place he had visited a few times before whenever he wanted to escape the overwhelming demands of stardom. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee and buttery pastries filled the air, a comforting contrast to the crisp, cool breeze outside. The cafe wasn't overly crowded, but there was a steady line of customers waiting patiently to place their orders. Dressed in his usual low-profile attire, a simple black hoodie, worn jeans, and his signature beanie, Keanu blended seamlessly into the crowd. No one had noticed him yet, and he preferred it that way. He had always loved these quiet, unassuming moments, where he could just be another person in the world rather than the globally recognized actor he was. He glanced around, taking in the cozy ambience, the warm yellow glow of the lights, the gentle hum of quiet conversations, and the rhythmic tapping of laptop keys from customers working remotely. It was peaceful, a rare moment of stillness in his often chaotic life. He sighed contentedly, shifting his weight slightly as he inched forward in line, waiting for his turn to order. A young barista at the counter was working diligently, her cheerful demeanor evident despite the morning rush. Keanu watched as she handled orders efficiently, smiling at each customer, making sure everyone felt welcome. It was the kind of sincerity that Keanu appreciated, people doing their jobs not just for the sake of it, but because they genuinely cared about the experience they were providing. He had no problem waiting, nor did anyone else in the line. After all, everyone had somewhere to be, but they understood the concept of patience and mutual respect. The soft chatter of the cafe created a soothing background noise, and Keanu found himself lost in thought for a moment, reflecting on how much he valued these simple pleasures. He didn't need extravagant luxuries or constant attention, just a good cup of coffee and a moment of peace. However, that peace was about to be shattered in the most unexpected way. As he stood there, merely 2 customers away from reaching the counter, the front door suddenly swung open with a forceful push, causing the small hanging bell above it to jingle violently. Heads instinctively turned toward the entrance, and in walked a woman who exuded an air of entitlement so strong it could be felt the moment she stepped inside. Dressed in an expensive designer coat with heels that clicked against the tiled floor, she carried an oversized handbag slung over one arm and a pair of oversized sunglasses perched atop her head despite being indoors. Her lips were pursed in impatience, and her eyes scanned the cafe as if she were above it all, already unimpressed with the common folk standing in line. Without so much as a second thought, she strutted forward, completely bypassing the queue as if it didn't exist. Gasps rippled through the customers as they exchanged incredulous glances, silently questioning if they had just witnessed what they thought they had. Keanu, who had remained largely unnoticed until now, found himself looking at her with mild curiosity, though his expression remained neutral. The woman, completely oblivious or perhaps just unconcerned, came to a stop directly in front of the counter, cutting off the person who had been about to order. The barista, momentarily taken aback, hesitated before politely addressing her. "Excuse me, ma'am," she said, her voice even and professional despite the blatant rudeness, "but there's a line." The woman scoffed as if the very idea of waiting was beneath her. "Oh, I don't have time for that," she said dismissively, waving her manicured hand. "I just need my coffee, and I need it now." An awkward silence settled over the cafe, tension hanging in the air as customers exchanged glances of disbelief. Some muttered under their breath, while others simply shook their heads. Keanu remained quiet, his face unreadable as he observed the unfolding scene. He had encountered people like her before, those who thought the world revolved around them, who believed their time was more valuable than everyone else's. It was an attitude he had never understood nor tolerated. The barista, maintaining her professionalism, gently tried again. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but everyone else has been waiting their turn. I'll be happy to take your order after the others." The woman let out an exaggerated sigh, clearly exasperated. "Do you even know who I am?" she demanded, as if her identity alone should grant her immediate service. This time, Keanu's lips twitched slightly, not in amusement, but in the quiet recognition of entitlement at its peak. He knew how it felt to be recognized, but he never used his status to gain special treatment. And yet, here she was, someone who wasn't even famous, demanding the kind of privilege she clearly hadn't earned. The barista, unfazed, responded simply, "No, ma'am, But that doesn't change the fact that there's a line. The woman huffed, folding her arms across her chest, her frustration mounting as she tapped her foot impatiently against the floor. "This is ridiculous," she muttered. "I don't have time for this nonsense." She turned slightly, her gaze sweeping over the customers she had just cut in front of. It was at that moment that she finally seemed to notice Keanu. However, rather than reacting to him as a celebrity, she merely glanced him over as if assessing whether he was someone important enough to acknowledge. Deciding he wasn't, she quickly averted her gaze, dismissing him without a second thought. If she had known who he was, she might have reconsidered her behavior. But that moment had passed, and now she had set herself up for something she could have never seen coming. Keanu, still calm and composed, simply continued to observe, silently forming a plan in his mind, one that would serve as the ultimate lesson in humility. The atmosphere in the cafe had shifted from its usual cozy warmth to an uncomfortable tension, all thanks to the self-important woman who had so brazenly cut the line. The murmurs of disbelief from the other customers filled the space, but the woman remained unfazed, either completely oblivious or willfully ignoring the growing irritation she had caused. Keanu, still standing where he had been before she barged in, observed her with quiet patience, his expression giving nothing away. He had spent a lifetime encountering people from all walks of life, kind souls who treated others with warmth and respect, and those who believed their status or appearance gave them the right to trample over common courtesy. Unfortunately, this woman fell into the latter category. As the barista stood her ground, refusing to be bullied into serving her ahead of the line, the woman's irritation only deepened. She let out an exaggerated huff, shifting her weight from one foot to the other as if merely standing in place was the greatest inconvenience of her life. "This is absurd," she snapped, tossing her expensive handbag onto the counter as if she owned the establishment. "I don't have time for this waiting nonsense." The barista, still remarkably composed, simply gave her a polite but firm smile. "I understand, ma'am, but everyone else here is also waiting for their turn. It's only fair." That response only made things worse. The woman rolled her eyes so dramatically that even people in the back of the cafe could see it. She turned slightly, addressing the other customers as if rallying support for her unjustified complaint. "Can you believe this?" she scoffed, gesturing wildly. "This is exactly what's wrong with customer service these days. No urgency, no efficiency. Just," she waved her hands again, "total incompetence." If she was expecting people to sympathize with her, she was sorely mistaken. Instead of agreeing, most of the customers gave her unimpressed stares. Some shook their heads in disapproval, while others exchanged knowing glances, silently urging the barista to hold firm. One elderly man standing behind Keanu even let out a quiet chuckle, amused by her sheer audacity. But the woman remained unaware, convinced of her own importance. "Ugh, forget this," she snapped. "I'll just order, and you can deal with it." With that, she turned back to the barista and, without missing a beat, began rattling off her order as if the previous conversation had never happened. "1 grande caramel macchiato, extra hot, extra caramel." "Actually, no, make that 2, she said, speaking quickly, her voice filled with impatience. "And a cranberry scone. No, wait, actually, do you have those almond croissants? If you don't, then forget it. And make sure the macchiato has oat milk. I can't do dairy, ugh." The barista didn't move, didn't write a single word down. Instead, she calmly repeated, "Ma'am, I can't take your order until you've waited in line like everyone else." The woman's jaw dropped, her mouth opening and closing as if she couldn't believe what she had just heard. "Are you kidding me?" she blurted, her voice rising in frustration. "Do you know who I am?" The cafe fell silent at her words, all eyes now on her. A couple of customers exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of amusement and disbelief. Keanu, still standing quietly, finally allowed a small smirk to form at the corners of his lips. The arrogance of entitlement was always fascinating to witness, and this woman was putting on a performance worthy of an award. The barista, to her credit, didn't waver. She simply shook her head. "No, ma'am, I don't. But that doesn't change the policy. The line is right there," she said, gesturing toward where Keanu and the other customers stood. The woman scoffed, turning her head dramatically as if searching for someone who would rescue her from this injustice. Her gaze swept over Keanu once again, but like before, she didn't recognize him. She looked at him up and down, as if assessing whether he was worth acknowledging, and, deciding that he wasn't, turned away dismissively. Keanu said nothing. He didn't need to. He had spent decades mastering the art of quiet observation, of waiting for the right moment. And now, that moment was fast approaching. The woman exhaled sharply, her patience wearing dangerously thin. "Oh, for God's sake," she muttered under her breath. "Fine, if you won't take my order, I'll just have my assistant come back later." She grabbed her designer handbag and spun around, prepared to walk away, until she suddenly remembered something. Turning back to the barista, she added, "Oh, and you should know, I'm leaving a terrible review. Your customer service is appalling." With that final dramatic proclamation, she turned on her heel and stormed toward the door, her heels clicking loudly against the cafe's floor. Customers stepped aside as she passed, many of them shaking their heads or rolling their eyes. A few even muttered sarcastic comments under their breath, but the woman was too caught up in her self-righteous indignation to notice. As she reached the door, she yanked it open with unnecessary force, causing the small bell above it to jingle violently again. But before she could storm out completely, something happened that stopped her in her tracks. A voice, calm, collected, and unmistakably familiar, spoke up from the line behind her. "I'll take care of everyone's orders," the voice said smoothly. The cafe went silent. Heads turned. The woman froze, her hand still gripping the door handle. Slowly, she turned back around, her brows furrowed in confusion. Who had spoken? And then, finally, she realized who had been standing in line all along. The man she had so rudely ignored. The man she had dismissed as unimportant. The man whose face was, in fact, very recognizable. Keanu Reeves. Her eyes widened in shock, her mouth falling open slightly as if the air had just been knocked out of her lungs. Keanu, still standing in line, now faced the barista directly. His expression remained as calm as ever, but there was something unmistakably intentional in the way he spoke his next words. "I'll pay for everyone's orders," he repeated, his voice carrying just enough weight to ensure that the entire cafe heard him. Then, after a brief pause, he added with the faintest hint of amusement, "Everyone except hers." The cafe erupted. Gasps and murmurs spread through the crowd like wildfire. Some people exchanged looks of shock, while others barely contained their laughter. The barista, who had been holding back a smile for the entire encounter, finally let it break free. The rude woman's face turned a deep shade of red, whether from embarrassment or fury, no one could tell. Her lips parted as if she wanted to argue, to fight back, to say something. But for the first time since she had stepped into the cafe, she was speechless. Keanu simply reached into his pocket, pulled out his wallet, and handed his card to the barista. "Go ahead," he said, nodding toward the rest of the customers. "Order whatever you like. It's on me." The cafe burst into applause. Cheers erupted from the customers who had been quietly enduring the woman's rudeness, their moods instantly lifted by Keanu's unexpected generosity. A young girl standing near the counter clapped excitedly, while an older gentleman chuckled approvingly. Even the barista, who had handled the situation with admirable grace, gave Keanu an appreciative nod. But the woman, she was livid. Her entire body tensed, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. She opened her mouth, closed it, then opened it again, struggling to find the words to respond. But there was nothing she could say. She had played herself into this moment, and now she had to face the consequences. And Keanu? He simply smiled. He had made his point. And the best part? He hadn't needed to say much at all. For a long, tense moment, the cafe remained a battleground of silence, with all eyes locked on the woman whose entitled tantrum had just backfired in the most spectacular way. She stood frozen near the doorway, her expensive handbag clutched tightly in her manicured fingers, her mouth hanging open in silent disbelief. Just minutes ago, she had strutted into this cafe as if she owned the place, dismissing the people around her as if they were insignificant background characters in the grand production that was her life. And now, in a single unexpected moment, she had been put in her place. Not through anger, not through confrontation, but through an act of pure, undeniable generosity. Keanu, on the other hand, remained as calm and collected as ever. There was no smugness in his expression, no trace of arrogance or malice in his demeanor. He had not raised his voice, nor had he insulted or belittled her. He had simply, gracefully, done something she had never anticipated. He had lifted up everyone around her while leaving her out of it entirely. And that, somehow, had stung more than any harsh words ever could. The barista, who had been watching the entire ordeal unfold, finally broke the silence with a small but victorious smile. "Well," she said cheerfully, accepting Keanu's credit card, "I guess that settles it." She turned to the customers still waiting in line and gestured for them to step forward. "All right, folks. Looks like your orders are covered today, courtesy of Mr. Reeves." The reaction was instantaneous. Cheers erupted from the people in line, their earlier frustration replaced with excitement and gratitude. A middle-aged woman beamed at Keanu, shaking her head in admiration. "You're a class act, sir," she said warmly. A young man in a hoodie, who had been quietly observing from the side, pumped his fist in the air. "Dude, that's legendary," he said, grinning. A father holding his toddler gave Keanu a nod of respect, while his child clapped her tiny hands, giggling. Keanu acknowledged them all with a simple smile and a slight nod. He had never been one for grandstanding or basking in attention. He had done this not for praise, but because he could, and because, in that moment, it had felt like the right thing to do. The woman, however, was far from appreciative. Her face had turned an unsettling shade of red, her nostrils flaring as she attempted to process what had just happened. "You," she sputtered, finally finding her voice. "You can't be serious." Keanu turned his head slightly, his gaze meeting hers for the first time since she had rudely dismissed him. His eyes, steady and composed, held no anger, no judgment, only an unwavering sense of quiet understanding. "I am," he said simply. Her lips pressed into a thin, angry line. "You think this is funny?" she hissed. Keanu exhaled softly, as if he had already predicted that she would react this way. "No," he replied calmly. "I think kindness goes a long way." He gestured subtly toward the line of people who were now happily placing their orders, their moods completely turned around from just moments ago. "And I think everyone here deserved a good morning." The implication in his words was crystal clear. Everyone had deserved a good morning, except her. The woman's jaw clenched, her nails digging into the leather straps of her handbag. She had spent years moving through life with the assumption that her status, her wealth, or simply her ability to demand things loudly enough would always get her what she wanted. But today, for the first time in what was probably a very long time, none of that had worked. And it had been Keanu Reeves of all people, an A-list celebrity, someone who could have easily ignored her and gone about his day, who had delivered the lesson. Her pride wouldn't allow her to admit defeat so easily. With a sharp inhale, she straightened her posture, adjusting the collar of her designer coat as if trying to reclaim some semblance of dignity. "Well," she said haughtily, her voice laced with forced indifference, "I don't need your charity." Keanu didn't flinch. He simply offered her a polite nod. "That's good," he said. "Because it wasn't for you." A ripple of laughter spread through the cafe. Some customers covered their mouths, while others simply shook their heads in amusement. Even the barista, who had maintained a remarkable level of professionalism throughout the ordeal, couldn't hide her grin. The woman's expression darkened further, her shoulders tensing as the weight of the situation finally settled over her. She had lost. Unable to stand another second of the humiliation, she let out an angry huff and turned sharply toward the door. Without another word, she stormed out, the sharp clicks of her heels echoing behind her. The cafe bell jingled one last time as the door swung shut, signaling the end of her reign of entitlement. The room was still for a moment before, once again, the cafe erupted into applause. People laughed, clapped, and exchanged murmurs of approval, the energy in the room now completely transformed. It was a strange, unexpected way for the morning to unfold, but no one was complaining, except for the woman who had just left, of course. The barista handed Keanu's card back to him, her smile still in place. "That was probably the best thing I've ever seen in here," she admitted. Keanu chuckled, slipping his card back into his wallet. Glad I could help. The young man who had been watching earlier leaned forward, grinning. Dude, seriously, you just turned a whole cafe into a movie scene. That was insane. Keanu shook his head, amusement dancing in his eyes. Just another morning, he said simply. Another customer, a woman in her 40s with a warm expression, placed a hand over her heart. You know, Mr. Reeves, I've heard stories about how kind you are, but seeing it in person, it really means something. Keanu simply smiled. Kindness is free, he said. Might as well share it. The sentiment resonated with everyone in the cafe. It was a simple truth, yet so many people forgot it in their daily lives. This morning had started as an ordinary day, but because of one rude woman and one humble man, it had become something far more memorable. The barista handed Keanu his coffee, which had finally been prepared amidst all the chaos. On the house, she said with a wink. Call it a thank you from us. Keanu hesitated for a moment before accepting it. All right, he said, lifting his cup slightly. But only if you let me leave a big tip. Laughter spread through the cafe once more, and as Keanu took a sip of his coffee, he felt a quiet satisfaction settle over him. It wasn't about the applause or the recognition. It never had been. It was about reminding people that, even in the smallest moments, kindness could make a difference. And today, it had. The cafe remained alive with excitement, the energy shifting completely from tense discomfort to an atmosphere of joy and camaraderie. What had started as an ordinary morning had now become a moment that the customers and staff would likely never forget. Keanu, having just subtly but effectively shut down the entitled woman's arrogance, remained as composed as ever, sipping his coffee as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened. And yet, for everyone in that cafe, something extraordinary had just taken place. The woman, having stormed out in a flurry of frustration and embarrassment, had left behind only the memory of her entitlement and the stunned silence that followed her exit. But the story was far from over. Keanu had done more than just expose her rudeness. He had actively turned the situation into an opportunity to spread kindness, and the impact of that decision was now unfolding before him. As the cafe patrons settled back into their places, the barista resumed taking orders, her mood noticeably lighter. All right, folks, she called out, a smile playing on her lips. Looks like today's a lucky day. Courtesy of Mr. Reeves, your orders are covered. A wave of gratitude rippled through the crowd. People turned to Keanu, offering their thanks in different ways, some with words, others with a simple nod of appreciation. A young woman, holding a textbook and clearly on a student's budget, beamed at him. You have no idea how much this helps, she said earnestly. I was debating if I should even get coffee today. Keanu gave her a small smile. Then it looks like today was meant to be. An elderly man, dressed in a modest jacket, adjusted his glasses and chuckled. I've always told people you were one of the good ones, he said. Guess I was right. Keanu merely shrugged, taking another sip of his coffee. He had never been one for attention or grand gestures. He simply did what felt right in the moment. And today, what felt right was ensuring that everyone, except one particular person, had a better morning. The barista worked efficiently, moving down the line, taking orders one by one. Each customer, grateful for Keanu's generosity, placed their orders with a bit more joy in their voices, chatting happily with one another. It was as if the negativity that had entered the cafe earlier had completely evaporated, replaced by a shared sense of goodwill. However, as the cafe settled into its new, much warmer atmosphere, the woman who had caused the initial disturbance had not completely disappeared. Outside, just past the glass door, she lingered. From where Keanu was standing, he could see her pacing back and forth, her phone clutched tightly in her perfectly manicured hands. Though the glare on the glass obscured most of her expression, it wasn't difficult to guess that she was fuming. Occasionally, she would glance back toward the cafe, her body language a mixture of frustration and hesitation. She hadn't expected things to go this way. She had walked in assuming she could throw her weight around, demand special treatment, and leave with her overpriced coffee in hand, unchallenged. Instead, she had been humbled in front of an entire room of strangers. And worse, she had done so without even realizing that she had insulted Keanu Reeves, of all people, a man adored worldwide for his humility and kindness. Keanu noticed the moment she made a decision. With a sharp inhale, she squared her shoulders and marched back toward the entrance, pushing the door open with far less force than before. The cafe's atmosphere dimmed slightly as customers noticed her reappearance. "Excuse me," she said sharply, her heels clicking against the tiled floor as she made her way back to the counter. Her voice carried an edge of forced composure, as if she was desperately trying to regain control of the situation. She turned to the barista, tilting her chin up slightly. "I would like to place my order now." The barista, who had just finished processing another customer's order, turned to face her. Her polite smile remained, but there was no longer the same warmth in her eyes. "Of course, ma'am," she said smoothly. "That'll be." Keanu gently cleared his throat, cutting in before the barista could finish. "Actually," he said, his voice just loud enough for everyone to hear, "I believe I made it clear earlier." The cafe went still again, all eyes shifting back to Keanu. The woman blinked, her feigned confidence faltering. "Excuse me." Keanu met her gaze calmly, his expression unreadable. "I said I'd cover everyone's order." He took another sip of his coffee before adding, "Everyone except yours." The impact of his words hit like a silent explosion. A few customers stifled laughter, while others exchanged glances filled with silent approval. The woman, clearly caught off guard, stiffened. For a moment, she seemed at a loss for how to respond. Then, her pride reared its head again. She scoffed, shaking her head. "This is ridiculous," she muttered. "What kind of grown man holds a grudge over something so small?" Keanu exhaled softly, tilting his head slightly. "It's not about holding a grudge," he said evenly. "It's about respect." The cafe fell even quieter, as if the entire room was collectively holding its breath. Keanu set his coffee down gently on the counter, turning fully to face her. "You walked in here today and decided that your time was more valuable than everyone else's. You dismissed the people in line, ignored the barista's professionalism, and treated the people around you like they didn't matter." He let his words settle before continuing, his voice steady. "And that's your choice. But kindness is my choice." The woman's mouth opened as if to argue, but nothing came out. She had nothing to say, no defense, no justification that could erase the truth of his words. A moment of awkward silence stretched between them before she let out a forced, bitter laugh. "Unbelievable," she muttered under her breath. Then, with a final dramatic toss of her hair, she turned on her heel and stormed back toward the exit, her face burning with humiliation. This time, she didn't linger outside. The cafe door closed behind her, and with it, the last remnants of her presence faded. As if on cue, the barista let out a breath and shook her head. "Well," she said, placing her hands on her hips. "That happened." Laughter spread through the cafe once again, the tension finally breaking for good. A few customers clapped, others simply sighed in relief. Keanu, still as relaxed as ever, picked up his coffee and took another sip. "All right, everyone," the barista called out with a grin. "Let's get back to making this a good morning." And just like that, the moment passed. Customers resumed their conversations, their spirits lifted by what they had just witnessed. Keanu, never one to linger in the spotlight for too long, simply gave a polite nod and returned to enjoying his coffee. For him, it had just been another morning. Another moment to show that kindness was always an option. But for everyone else in that cafe, it had been a lesson. A reminder that entitlement and arrogance would only get you so far, but respect and kindness? They could change everything. As the cafe settled back into a comfortable rhythm, an undeniable buzz of excitement lingered in the air. Customers whispered among themselves, replaying the moment in their heads, exchanging glances filled with a mix of amusement and admiration. It wasn't every day that they got to witness such a perfect display of justice, one executed not with cruelty, not with revenge, but with pure, calculated kindness. Keanu, meanwhile, remained entirely unfazed. He sipped his coffee, seemingly unaffected by the ripples of his own actions. To him, this wasn't about making a scene, nor was it about proving a point to the world. It was about respect. About teaching, in the simplest and most graceful way possible, that kindness was not a privilege. it was a choice. And today, he had chosen to spread it to those who had deserved it the most. The barista, still slightly stunned by how the situation had unfolded, gave Keanu a look of sheer appreciation. That was incredible, she admitted, shaking her head as she wiped down the counter. I've had to deal with people like her before, but I've never seen someone handle it quite like that. Keanu offered her a small, humble smile. You handled it pretty well yourself, he said, nodding toward her. Not many people would have had the patience you did. She chuckled, exhaling slowly. Yeah, well, I try. But it definitely helps when someone backs you up. A nearby customer, an older gentleman with a newspaper tucked under his arm, grinned as he leaned against the counter. You know, he said, looking at Keanu, I've always believed that karma has a way of catching up to people. But I've never seen it happen so quickly. Laughter rippled through the cafe at his words, the energy shifting from disbelief to pure joy. A younger man, who had been sitting in the corner with his laptop, shook his head in admiration. That was cinematic, he said. Like, if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes, I'd think it was a movie script. A woman with 2 children approached Keanu, her eyes filled with gratitude. You didn't just make our morning, you made our week, she said, adjusting the strap of her purse. People don't always stand up to rudeness like that, and when they do, it usually just turns into an argument. But you turned it into something positive. Keanu gave her a warm, modest nod. Glad to hear it. The young girl beside her, no older than 8, tugged at her mother's sleeve before looking up at Keanu with wide, admiring eyes. You're like a real-life superhero, she said, bouncing slightly on her toes. The cafe erupted into laughter again, and Keanu, genuinely amused, crouched down slightly to her level. Superheroes wear capes, he said, gesturing at his hoodie. I just wear coffee stains. The little girl giggled, and her mother ruffled her hair before mouthing a silent thank you to Keanu. He simply nodded again, his smile lingering as he stood back up. Meanwhile, outside the cafe, the woman who had been the catalyst of all this was pacing furiously on the sidewalk. She had pulled out her phone, clearly ranting to someone on the other end, her gestures erratic and her face a mixture of anger and frustration. She's still out there, the barista whispered with a smirk, nodding toward the window. Keanu followed her gaze but showed no reaction. He had no desire to gloat or further embarrass the woman. Her own actions had already done that for her. Instead, he simply took another sip of his coffee, letting the moment pass. But the other customers weren't as willing to let it go unnoticed. A young man near the window snickered. She's probably calling her manager to complain about reality. Another woman, scrolling through her phone, suddenly gasped. Oh. People turned to her, curious. She lifted her screen slightly, revealing a photo someone had snapped from inside the cafe. Keanu was visible in the shot, mid-sip, while the woman was frozen in the doorway, her face caught in pure shock. It's already online, the woman said with wide eyes. Someone posted it on Twitter, and it's going viral fast. A murmur of excitement spread through the cafe. Let me see, a man nearby said, leaning in. Oh wow, the comments are brutal, another customer added. People are dragging her. Keanu, however, simply smiled and shook his head. Let's not pile on, he said gently. She got the message. No need to make it worse. It was a reminder, subtle but powerful, that while he had stood up against rudeness, he hadn't done it to punish anyone. He had done it to show that dignity and kindness would always outweigh entitlement. Still, the reality of the situation was undeniable. The woman, who had walked in with an air of superiority, expecting to command the room, had instead become an example of what not to do. And now, thanks to the power of social media, her behavior was being exposed to an audience far larger than she had ever anticipated. A few minutes later, the woman, still clutching her phone, finally seemed to accept defeat. With a final frustrated shake of her head, she turned sharply on her heel and disappeared down the street, her heels clicking loudly as she vanished from view. A soft applause spread through the cafe, this time quieter, more subdued, but no less meaningful. Well, the barista said with a small chuckle. I think that's the last we'll see of her. Keanu smiled but said nothing. He had no need for a victory lap. He had already won in the way that mattered. Instead, he simply picked up his coffee, took another sip, and let out a satisfied sigh. The morning had started out like any other. But now, it was one worth remembering. As the final traces of the entitled woman's presence faded down the street, the cafe returned to its usual warm and inviting rhythm. But something was different. A new energy pulsed through the room, not one of routine, but of camaraderie, of a shared experience that had unexpectedly brought everyone together. What had begun as an ordinary morning filled with coffee runs and quiet conversations had transformed into a moment of collective justice, orchestrated not by anger or retaliation, but by the simplest and most powerful force of all, kindness. Keanu, still standing near the counter, had become the unlikely center of this moment, though not by his own intention. He hadn't walked into the cafe that morning expecting to make a statement. He had merely been waiting for his coffee, just like everyone else. But life, as always, had a way of presenting opportunities to those who were ready to meet them. As the barista rang up the final orders, courtesy of Keanu's generosity, she couldn't help but shake her head in disbelief. "You know," she said, placing a fresh cup of coffee on the counter, "I don't think I've ever seen anything quite like that." Keanu glanced up at her. His expression relaxed. "Like what?" She gave him a knowing smile. "That," she said, gesturing toward the customers, who were still buzzing with conversation. "The way you handled it. You didn't call her out. You didn't argue. You just showed her who she really was, without saying much at all." Keanu chuckled softly, taking a sip of his drink. "Sometimes people don't need to be told they're wrong," he said. "They just need to see it for themselves." The barista let out a low whistle. Well, she definitely saw it. A young man near the window, still scrolling through his phone, suddenly let out a laugh. "Oh man," he said, shaking his head. "This thing is everywhere now." A few customers leaned in, curious. "Still trending?" "Oh, definitely trending," the man confirmed, tilting his phone to show the screen. "There's already like 100 different versions of it. Some people are calling it Keanu's Coffee Karma." Another customer laughed. "That's got a nice ring to it." A woman in her 40s, holding a cup of tea, smiled. "You know, I think this might actually teach her something." Keanu, ever humble, shrugged. "Maybe," he said. "Maybe not. People change when they're ready to." The words hung in the air, thoughtful and true. And yet, as the world outside the cafe continued to react, as the story spread across social media, something interesting was happening. The woman, the same woman who had stormed in believing herself untouchable, was being confronted by a force she hadn't expected. She was becoming accountable. Screenshots of her behavior had been shared thousands of times, with comments pouring in from people who recognized themselves in the situation, either as someone who had been on the receiving end of entitlement or perhaps someone who had once been guilty of it themselves. Some were quick to mock her, others took a more thoughtful approach, but the message was clear: the world had little patience for unnecessary cruelty. The woman, still oblivious to how far her actions had traveled, finally sat down on a nearby bench, pulling her sunglasses over her face as she scrolled through her phone. The realization was setting in. This wasn't just about one morning, one cafe. This was about how she had chosen to treat people, and now the world was watching. Back inside, a young girl, no older than 10, approached Keanu hesitantly, her hands clasped around her own cup of hot chocolate. "Excuse me, Mr. Reeves," she said shyly. Keanu turned toward her, his expression instantly softening. "Hey there," he said, crouching slightly so he was at her eye level. "What's up?" The girl bit her lip before speaking. "I just wanted to say that was really nice," she said. "What you did for everyone." Keanu smiled. "Thank you," he said. "That means a lot." She hesitated for a second before adding, "I think the lady outside was just really mad. Maybe she had a bad morning." Keanu considered her words carefully. "Maybe," he said. "But we all have bad mornings. It's what we do with them that matters." The girl nodded thoughtfully. "So, even if someone's mean, you should still be nice?" Keanu smiled. Not for them, he said gently. For you. The girl grinned. I like that. With a final nod, she turned and skipped back to her table, her mother watching with quiet pride. The lesson Keanu had unknowingly given the cafe that morning was one that had resonated far beyond the walls of that small space. It wasn't about humiliating someone, nor was it about revenge. It was about demonstrating, through action, not just words, that kindness would always have more power than entitlement. And perhaps, just perhaps, the woman outside, still sitting on the bench, still scrolling through endless tweets about herself, would come to realize that too. As the morning sun climbed higher, the cafe gradually emptied, with people going about their day, carrying with them the memory of what had just unfolded. Keanu, having finished his coffee, finally stood up, stretching slightly before pulling his hoodie over his head. The barista, now fully caught up on orders, called out, "You heading out?" Keanu nodded. "Yeah, got places to be." She smirked. "Well, thanks for making my shift a lot more interesting." He chuckled. "Glad to help." A few remaining customers waved as he headed for the door, their expressions filled with gratitude. Just before stepping outside, Keanu turned back briefly. The cafe, once a place of quiet normalcy, now held something intangible. A memory, a lesson, a story that people would tell long after today. With one last small nod, he pushed the door open, stepping into the busy world beyond. And just like that, he was gone. But the moment would last forever.